Hello and welcome to this devlog on how I made a Slay the Spire-style map in my roguelike autobattler game, where a player takes a single path across multiple choices, collects different rewards, and eventually reaches the final boss. First off, I started with a simple level grid generation, which consisted of multiple floors of levels, all of which were interconnected, but that looked a bit cluttered and probably not what players expect. Later on I stumbled upon an online guide with precise details how the level grid was actually generated in Slay the Spire. So I've implemented exactly the same algorithm and the resulted grid started to look much more readable. Then I've added some level icons to distinguish between the different types of events on the map. The result was good, but looked a bit basic, so I wanted to experiment and add some interesting details to the map terrain. I've been doing some research on procedural map generation and stumbled upon multiple techniques. The first one was cellular automata that can be used to generate interesting terrain using simple rules. And it was not difficult to implement either, so I started to see some nice results very quickly. Next up, I wanted to make it less blocky and rectangular, and I came across a technique called marching squares. Well, Wikipedia says marching squares is an algorithm that generates contours for a two-dimensional scalar field. In a nutshell, it basically uses 16 codes for all possible 2D tiles to render the set contours. After carefully coding all 16 cases, I could finally see the result. So these are the shapes generated by that marching squares algorithm. When I overlaid my previously implemented level grid on top of that terrain, I realized it's not perfectly aligned and the level nodes are sort of floating in the water. In order to overcome this, I had to use so-called meta balls, which is another technique, and I don't want to go into details, but they're basically the randomly placed circles, and now we're marching around those circles and making sure they're always inside the contour. To make our map look even better, I changed the color palette of both the water and the terrain, and I've also placed some randomly generated trees, making sure they're not overlapping with the level icons. As a nice little touch, I've added a 3D extrusion to the terrain mesh, and also made the water plane geometry animated by dynamically adjusting the z-coordinate of its vertices, using a simple sine function, which resulted in a nicely looking visual effect of animated waves. Then I tried upscaling the resolution of the marching square grid to make it more fine-grained. I'm not sure if I like this result more, or I'm spending too much time on these improvements. Anyway, the perfect is the enemy of good. Moving on. My initial marching square implementation was naive and had a significant drawback. Each individual square tile was constructed as a separate 3D mesh, which was both inefficient and prevented me from adding extra effects, such as this bevel wasn't applied correctly. Consequently, I had to scrap the old code and re-implement the algorithm by tracing all the outer vertices of each individual island and using them to construct the mesh. However, with this approach, the tricky part was to distinguish the inner contours, which represent the holes, from the outer ones, which make up the islands themselves. In order to correctly identify which contours were which, I had to use the technique called flood fill, which basically paints the map and assigns colors to all interconnected regions. And we can use these to tell whether a particular tile or vertex belongs to a particular region. Now that we have separated the inner holes from the outer contours, we can finally construct the marching square island meshes and cut the necessary holes in them. This is the final look of the map so far. I've added the 3D model icons and colored them to make things more polished. I can even zoom in to see the bevels or switch the camera angle to see all the details of this 3D world. And that's it. Thank you very much for watching the video. Hope you find it useful and stay tuned for more content in the future.